Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are stepping into the dusty sun-baked world of late 15th century Spain, a land of zealous faith, brutal political ambition, and a queen so strange, so shrouded in rumour and sorrow that her story still feels like a waking dream. You'll hear whispers of a royal mausoleum and a ghostly procession that dragged a dead king's coffin across the scorched earth for years. This is a story of love so intense it bordered on insanity, of a mind so brilliant it shattered under pressure, and a body so stubbornly unwashed it earned its own kind of fame. You're about to meet Juana of Castile, also known as Juana the Mad, a woman whose life was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, if Shakespeare had also included a strong subplot about personal hygiene, or the distinct lack thereof. You probably won't survive this journey with your faith in fairy tale monarchies intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can all feel a little less alone in the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We find you, a young noble, walking the cold, echoing halls of the court of Castile. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood, punctuated by the occasional waft of roasted meat from the kitchens. Your footsteps are swallowed by the vast, heavy silence, and it's here, amidst this rigid formality, that you first catch sight of her. Not a glimpse, really, but an impression. She's a girl, perhaps 10 or 11, her hair a cascade of auburn, her eyes a deep, intelligent blue. Her name is Juana, and she's a daughter of the most powerful couple on the continent, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon, the very monarchs who united Spain and famously sent Christopher Columbus on his journey across the Atlantic. You see her, not in a grand courtly procession, but in a quiet antechamber, hunched over a book of Latin philosophy, her brow furrowed in concentration. This is the world Juana was born into, a world of paradoxes. On one hand, it's a golden age for Spain. Isabella and Ferdinand, known to history as the Catholic monarchs, have just expelled the last of the Muslim rulers from Granada, completing the Reconquista. They are consolidating their power, funding voyages of discovery, and building a global empire. But on the other hand, it's a world of unyielding religious fervour. The Spanish Inquisition is in full swing. The pressure to conform, to be pious, and to uphold the family's honour is immense. And for Juana, the third child and second daughter, this pressure is a constant, suffocating presence. You watch as her tutor, a stern priest, gestures at a celestial globe, pointing out the constellations. You know her education is rigorous, even by royal standards. While her older sister Isabella is being groomed for marriage, and her older brother Juan for the throne, Juana is being educated to be a powerful diplomatic asset. She studies Latin, Greek, and other European languages. She reads philosophy, theology, mathematics, and law. Her intellect is undeniable, a sharp and curious mind that absorbs information like a sponge. But you notice something else, something that sets her apart. While her siblings are being taught the practicalities of court life and piety, Juana's curiosity often seems to stray beyond the official curriculum. She asks questions that a girl of her station is not supposed to ask. Why, she might ask, does God allow suffering? Why are the stars fixed in their paths? You can almost hear the tutor's exasperated sigh as he steers her back to a more orthodox line of questioning. Her mother, Queen Isabella, is a formidable presence. A devout Catholic, a warrior queen who would ride into battle in full armour, she expects nothing less than absolute piety and obedience from her children. She oversees every aspect of their lives, from their daily prayers to their choice of clothing. You see the queen watching Juana with a mixture of pride and unease. Pride in her daughter's intelligence, but unease at her perceived lack of docility. Juana is not like her older sister Isabella, who is the perfect obedient princess. Juana has a fiery, passionate temperament that occasionally flares up, a stubbornness that clashes with the rigid expectations of the court. This is a crucial, if fringe, tidbit about her childhood. Juana reportedly had a penchant for getting into arguments with her mother's court ladies, particularly on theological matters. She was not just passively absorbing her education, she was actively engaging with it and sometimes actively challenging it. As you observe the royal family, you see the delicate political web they're weaving. Isabella and Ferdinand are master strategists, using their children as pawns in a grand game of thrones. Their eldest son, Juan, is set to marry Margaret of Austria, forging an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, is married to the Crown Prince of Portugal. And Juana, she's being saved for the most ambitious alliance of all, a marriage to Philip, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and the heir to the vast Burgundian territories. This alliance is meant to encircle France and secure the Habsburg dynasty's dominance in Europe. Historians still argue whether Juana's unconventional behaviour and mental fragility were present from a very young age, or if they were later developed traits exacerbated by the immense pressures she faced. Some chronicles from the time hint at a restless, melancholic nature, while others describe her as simply being unusually independent-minded. Was she a victim of her time, a brilliant woman trapped in an era that only valued conformity and obedience? Or was there a genetic predisposition to mental illness that was simply waiting for the right kind of stress to trigger it? It's a debate that lingers, a question mark hanging over her entire life. In this cloistered, devout, and politically charged environment, you realise something. Juana's childhood is not one of carefree innocence. It's a gilded cage, a place where every word is weighed, every action scrutinised, and every emotion is expected to be controlled. She's being raised to be a queen, but not a person, and you can't help but feel a sense of foreboding, a quiet understanding that the passion simmering just beneath her carefully composed exterior will not be contained forever. The court of Castile is a place of deep contrasts. On one hand, it's the heart of a burgeoning world power, a hub of diplomacy and discovery. On the other, it's a place of almost monastic severity. Dinner is often accompanied by readings from the lives of saints. Entertainment is limited to religious plays or courtly music. Laughter, if it happens at all, is a quiet, reserved thing. For a girl as full of life and curiosity as Juana, it must have felt stifling. You can practically hear the tension in the air, a hum of unspoken expectations and unfulfilled desires. She's a bird with clipped wings, dreaming of flight. And soon, very soon, she will be sent on a journey across a vast ocean to a world entirely different from her own, a journey that will test the very limits of her mind and her heart. You stand on the bustling docks of Laredo, the salty sea air whipping your hair and stinging your eyes. The year is 1496. Before you, a fleet of 130 ships, a colossal armada, is being prepared for a momentous voyage. This isn't a fleet of exploration like Columbus's tiny caravels. This is a vessel of diplomacy, a gilded cage on the water. And you are here to witness the departure of Juana, the young Infanta of Castile, on her way to meet her future husband. The political stakes are so immense that her father, Ferdinand, insists on an escort of 20,000 men and an entire court of courtiers, ladies-in-waiting, and servants. This isn't a wedding trip. It's an invasion force in waiting, a show of sheer Spanish might. You can practically hear the creaking of the ship's rigging and the shouts of the sailors as they ready the great vessels. Juana, now 16 years old, stands on the gangplank, a slight figure in the autumn wind. Her expression is unreadable. You can't tell if it's fear, resignation, or a flicker of excitement for the new world she's about to enter. Her mother, Queen Isabella, watches from the shore, her face a mask of solemn duty. A powerful mainstream historical fact is that this journey was delayed for weeks by fierce storms, which many at court interpreted as a bad omen. The superstitious whispers are a low hum among the onlookers. Some say God is displeased with this alliance. Others say it's a sign of a troubled marriage to come. As you step aboard one of the escort ships, you get a closer look at the people travelling with the young Infanta. They are a chosen group, hand-picked by Queen Isabella herself. The ladies-in-waiting are all older, matronly figures of impeccable reputation, tasked with ensuring Juana's piety and virtue remain unblemished. There are priests, advisors, and personal guards. This isn't a retinue for a young woman. It's a moral and political fortress built around her. The Queen is not just sending her daughter off to be married. She is sending her to be a Spanish queen, a bastion of Catholic virtue in the more liberal and worldly court of the Low Countries. The sheer number of people surrounding Juana is a testament to the fact that her parents do not trust her to be on her own. a fringe tidbit that hints at the deep-seated worry they already had about her passionate nature. The voyage itself is long and arduous. For 2 weeks, the fleet is tossed about by the relentless waves of the Bay of Biscay. The luxurious ships become cramped, rolling prisons. You feel the constant nauseating motion, and the air becomes heavy with the smell of seasickness and unwashed bodies. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen from our last series? The lack of hygiene on these ships makes you long for even that. Juana is, by all accounts, a terrible sailor, and she spends much of the journey confined to her cabin, pale and miserable. She's a princess, accustomed to the comforts of a palace, and this journey is a physical and psychological trial. As the ships finally enter the English Channel and the waters calm, you see the first signs of Juana's curious nature emerging. She spends hours on deck, staring at the grey, churning water, asking the sailors questions about the tides and the constellations. She reads not just her prayer book, but also books on navigation and geography that she has smuggled aboard. This is the intellectual curiosity that her tutors had tried to contain, now set free by the vast open sea. She's not just a political pawn, she's a mind, restless and alive. The fleet finally lands in the town of Middelburg, in the Netherlands, a cold, grey place so different from the sun-drenched landscapes of Spain. The sight of the shore is a welcome relief, but it is also the beginning of the next chapter of Juana's story, one she will enter completely alone. Her ladies and her retinue disembark with her, but the world she now steps into is utterly foreign. The people speak a different language, wear different clothes, and practice a different, more relaxed kind of faith. The air itself feels different, heavy with a damp chill that seems to seep into your bones. The Habsburg court is famously cosmopolitan and sophisticated. Her future husband, Philip, is the son of the Holy Roman Emperor and the heir to a sprawling inheritance that includes Flanders, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. This is a far cry from the pious, austere court of her mother. The Habsburgs are known for their love of art, music, and courtly spectacle. Juana, a product of the Spanish Inquisition's rigid piety, is about to be thrown into a world of lavish banquets, extravagant parties, and a court culture that, to her Spanish eyes, must seem almost scandalously liberal. The very purpose of this journey is marriage. The arranged marriage was the foundation of European royal diplomacy for centuries, and for Juana, it was a foregone conclusion from birth. But what happens now in this new land is anything but foregone. You know that Juana's passionate nature, which was so stifled in Spain, is about to encounter a personality that is equally, if not more, passionate and willful. Philip the Handsome, as he is known, is famous for his charm, his good looks, and his love of life. He is everything her parents tried to protect her from, a temptation, a challenge, a whirlwind of charisma. Historians still argue whether Philip's notorious infidelity was a result of his own character, or a consequence of his wife's later erratic behaviour. But at this point in the story, Juana and Philip have not even met yet. All she knows of him is what she's been told, that he is handsome, charming, and the key to her family's political ambitions. The pressure on her is immense. She is not just marrying a man, she is uniting two of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Her parents have invested millions in this union, in the ships, the people, the diplomatic manoeuvring. Failure is simply not an option. As you walk through the narrow, cobbled streets of Middelburg, Juana is led to a temporary residence. The townspeople stare, awed by the sheer scale of the Spanish entourage. You see Juana's ladies-in-waiting bustling around her, trying to make her comfortable, but you can feel the isolation. She's surrounded by her own people, yes, but she is miles from home, in a foreign land, about to meet a man she has only ever seen in a portrait. Her entire future hinges on this one meeting, and this is where the real drama begins. The plan was for a formal, stately meeting, a grand procession, and a wedding ceremony that would be a carefully choreographed spectacle. But as with so many of Juana's plans, this one is about to be completely derailed by a single powerful emotion. It's a moment of passion, a spark that will ignite a fire that will burn for decades, consuming not only her, but an entire kingdom. The two fiery personalities, Juana and Philip, are on a collision course, and you, as you watch her from the shadows, can feel the tension in the air, the sense that something momentous, and possibly disastrous, is about to happen. You have seen the gilded cage of her childhood. Now you are about to see what happens when the bird inside is finally set free. You are waiting in the grand antechamber of a castle in Lille. The air is warm and heavy with the scent of lilies and tapestries, a stark contrast to the salt and damp of the recent sea voyage. You and the rest of the Spanish entourage are buzzing with nervous anticipation. It's been weeks since Juana arrived, and the official meeting with her future husband, Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, has been delayed by a series of diplomatic and logistical snags. But the day has finally arrived. The plan, as always, is for a formal staged encounter where two royal houses will meet, not two people. Juana, a princess raised in the strictest Catholic court in Europe, is supposed to behave with perfect decorum. Philip, a prince famous for his courtly manners and charming roguishness, is expected to be a perfect gentleman. Suddenly a commotion erupts in the outer courtyard. A group of young men on horseback, laughing and a bit dishevelled from a hunt, gallop past the window. One of them, a tall, powerfully built young man with golden hair and a winning smile, looks up and catches sight of the Spanish retinue. This, you realise with a jolt, is Philip. He is 21 years old, a year older than Juana, and his reputation for being the handsome is not an exaggeration. He has an open, charismatic face, a clear complexion, and eyes that seem to sparkle with an untamed energy. This is a crucial, if fringe, tidbit about their initial meeting. Philip had been in the region and decided to ride to meet her on his own, forgoing all the proper diplomatic protocols. He was, to put it mildly, impatient. Juana, still in her travelling clothes, is completely unprepared for this informal, almost casual intrusion. Her Spanish ladies-in-waiting gasp in shock. This is not how things are done. Philip, however, has never cared for how things are done. Instead of a formal introduction, he simply strides into the antechamber. He sees Juana, and according to later accounts, it was a moment of immediate and profound recognition. A mainstream historical fact is that the moment their eyes met, all the carefully constructed plans for a long drawn-out courtship and formal engagement dissolved into thin air. Juana, despite her rigid upbringing, feels a powerful magnetic pull, and Philip, a man who has had his pick of courtly ladies and is known for his flings, is utterly captivated. The two of them, products of such different worlds, are suddenly the only two people in the room. He speaks to her in a mix of French and Spanish, and she, with her fluent command of both, answers him in her clear, strong voice. The conversation, which should have been about matters of state and protocol, quickly becomes something else entirely, a genuine, unguarded exchange of two young souls who find something in each other they never knew they were missing. The next few days are a whirlwind of passion that completely shocks the Spanish retinue. Philip, who has no patience for waiting, demands that the wedding take place immediately. Not in a few weeks, not after the arrival of more dignitaries, but now. This impulsive demand sends a shockwave through both courts. Her Spanish advisers are aghast. A rushed wedding would be a diplomatic disaster, a breach of every rule and expectation. But Juana, for the first time in her life, is not listening to her advisers. She is listening to her heart. And for the first time, she is acting on her own desires. A quirky tidbit about this time is that the wedding was so impromptu that many of the essential documents and ceremonies had to be rushed, causing a frenzy among the officials trying to keep up. The wedding itself is a simple private affair in the main chapel of the palace, a stark contrast to the grand public spectacle that was originally planned. As you watch from the back of the chapel, you see Juana, not as a political pawn, but as a young woman deeply and genuinely in love. The love in her eyes is undeniable. And Philip, the charming rake, looks at her not just with desire, but with a kind of possessive awe. He is famous for his love affairs, but this is different. This is a powerful, mutual passion that feels almost dangerous in its intensity. Historians still argue whether this immediate, all-consuming passion was a blessing or a curse for their relationship. Some say it was the only thing that could have broken through Juana's years of rigid conditioning, allowing her to finally feel and express genuine emotion. Others argue that it set a dangerous precedent, establishing a relationship based on wild extremes, rather than on a solid foundation of trust and respect. The passion, they say, was a double-edged sword, a source of immense joy and later, profound suffering. Their first few months of marriage are a blissful bubble of private happiness. Philip, who had been a notorious philanderer, seems to be completely devoted to Juana. He calls her my jewel and lavishes her with gifts and affection. She, in turn, is completely smitten. She, who had been so quiet and introspective, is now vivacious and full of life. They spend their days riding together, hunting and exploring the vast estates of the Burgundian court. They are a beautiful, glamorous couple, and you can't help but be caught up in the romance of it all. It's a fairy tale, a dream. But you know that in these courtly worlds, dreams rarely last. The rest of the Spanish entourage, particularly Juana's ladies-in-waiting, are horrified by this turn of events. They write panicked letters back to Queen Isabella, describing in breathless detail the lack of piety in the Habsburg court, and more importantly, Juana's apparent submission to Philip's every whim. They report that she no longer attends daily mass, that she dresses in a more revealing fashionable style, and that she seems to be completely consumed by her love for her husband. These reports do not go over well in the devout court of Castile. Queen Isabella, who had sent her daughter to be a pious political asset, now sees her as a lost soul, a victim of her own passions and her husband's worldly influence. This initial period of bliss is a crucial part of Juana's story. For the first time, she is truly alive. She is not a pawn, a daughter, or a princess. She is a woman in love, and that love is intense, consuming, and utterly intoxicating. It is also, you realise, the key to her later sorrow. This is a woman who, having tasted the sweet wine of true passion, will never be able to go back to the bitter waters of duty and decorum. This period of pure, unadulterated happiness will be the yardstick against which all her later suffering is measured. It will be the memory she clings to as her world falls apart. As you witness this fiery romance, you can't help but think about her mother's reaction. Queen Isabella, a woman of deep faith and rigid control, is in a state of utter shock. She had expected her daughter to be a dutiful wife, a tool of diplomacy. Instead, she has become a woman in love, a powerful and unpredictable force. The stage is set for a clash of wills between mother and daughter, a clash that will have devastating consequences. The love between Juana and Philip is a fire, bright and warm, but you know that every fire needs fuel. And in their case, the fuel will be jealousy, betrayal, and a series of tragic events that will shatter their fragile world. The honeymoon period, that blissful, feverish bubble of love, seems to last forever in the Habsburg court. You watch as Juana and Philip become a local legend, a couple so deeply in love they can barely stand to be apart. They are a study in contrasts that somehow work. Juana, with her sharp intellect and deep passions, and Philip with his easy charm and love of spectacle. He teaches her to love the hunt, to ride with the wind in her hair across the Flemish countryside. She introduces him to the more philosophical side of life, debating theology and history late into the night. It's an intoxicating mix of physical desire and intellectual connection. A mainstream historical fact of this period is that Juana became pregnant very quickly after their marriage. Their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor, was born in 1498. Over the next several years they would have 6 children together, a testament to the powerful physical bond they shared. For a time, it seems that their happiness is unshakable. They are the golden couple of Europe, heirs to 2 vast empires, and blessed with a healthy, growing family. But even in the midst of this bliss, you can see the first cracks beginning to form. Philip, for all his devotion to Juana, is still a product of his upbringing. The Habsburg court is a place of casual dalliances, of mistresses and affairs that are considered a normal part of courtly life. While he is initially captivated by Juana, the thrill of the chase, the ease of flirtation, is a deep-seated habit he finds hard to break. And Juana, the girl raised in the strict pious world of her mother's court, where such things are considered grave sins, is not prepared for this. She has given her entire heart to this man, and she expects the same in return. Her love is not a casual thing, it is an all-consuming fire. You start to see her jealously flare up, a terrifying and unpredictable force. At first, it's just a look, a sharp word, a cold shoulder. But as Philip's indiscretions become more frequent and more flagrant, her behaviour becomes more and more extreme. A quirky tidbit about this time is that Juana once reportedly attacked one of her husband's suspected mistresses with a pair of scissors, cutting off her hair in a fit of rage. This is not the mild, philosophical girl from Castile anymore. This is a woman consumed by a powerful visceral emotion. Her jealousy is not just a passing mood, it's a deep-seated conviction that she is being betrayed, that the one source of happiness in her life is being threatened. The contrast between her passion and Philip's casual disregard for her feelings is a toxic one. For him, a casual affair is just that, a fling. He doesn't understand that for her, it is a mortal wound, a betrayal of everything she holds sacred. He tries to placate her, to charm her back into a good mood, but the charm that once entranced her now feels like a weapon, a tool he uses on others. The arguments between them become more and more frequent and more public. They fight in front of their courtiers, their voices rising, their words sharp with hurt and anger. Juana in her rage would lash out at him with furious accusations. Philip in turn would become exasperated and retreat, which only inflamed her further. The once glamorous couple becomes a source of court gossip and a diplomatic problem. Their private turmoil is becoming a public spectacle. Her Spanish retinue, the ladies-in-waiting and advisors Queen Isabella sent with her, are horrified by her behaviour. They write letters back to Spain, describing her as hysterical, unhinged, and completely under the sway of her emotions. Her mother's worst fears are being realised. The girl with the fiery temperament is now a woman of unbridled passions, and in their world such a thing is seen not as a sign of love, but as a symptom of a grave spiritual or even mental illness. They cannot understand the depth of her feelings, and they do not want to. They see her as a broken vessel, an embarrassment to the family name. Historians still argue whether Philip's chronic infidelity was a deliberate form of psychological cruelty, a way to exert control over his wife, or if it was simply the result of his own character flaws and the casual sexual mores of the Habsburg court. There is evidence to suggest both. He was a product of his environment, yes, but he also knew exactly how deeply his actions hurt her, and he seemed, at times, to derive a certain kind of power from her pain. He was not a monster, but he was certainly not a saint, and his inability to understand the depth of Juana's love was a grave failing. You watch as Juana, isolated and alone in this foreign land, her only true confidant being a husband who is constantly betraying her, begins to withdraw. Her intellectual pursuits, the philosophy and history she once loved, seem to fade away. She becomes obsessed with her husband's movements, his whereabouts, his every look and gesture. She's a woman consumed by a single, powerful emotion, and it is eating her alive. A peculiar tidbit from this time is that she began sleeping in her clothes at night, reportedly because she was afraid of being left alone, or perhaps because she wanted to be ready to follow Philip should he try to sneak out. This is not the action of a happy, well-adjusted woman. This is the action of a mind unravelling. The contrast between their blissful beginning and their tumultuous present is heartbreaking. The whirlwind romance that once seemed like a fairy tale now feels like a prison. The love that once set her free has now become a chain, binding her to a man who, while he may have loved her in his own way, could never love her in the way she needed. He could never be faithful to her, and she could never accept his unfaithfulness. It was an impossible situation, and you can see the toll it is taking on her. This period is crucial because it is the beginning of the end. The seeds of her later, more profound mental distress are being sown here, in this fertile ground of passion and betrayal. The constant emotional turmoil, the public shame, the deep-seated jealousy, it all contributes to a psychological breakdown that will have devastating consequences, not just for her, but for all of Europe. You have seen the caged bird, the brief flight of freedom, and now you are watching the fall, and you know that the fall from such a height will be long and painful. You are now a silent observer in the court of Juana and Philip, and the atmosphere has shifted from a whirlwind of passion to a heavy, suffocating cloud of tension. The public bickering has become a daily occurrence, and the once adoring glances between the royal couple have been replaced by cold stares and sharp words. Juana's jealousy has morphed from an occasional fit of rage into an all-consuming obsession. She follows Philip's every move, questions his every absence, and lashes out at anyone she suspects of being his confidant or, worse, his new conquest. A mainstream historical fact is that she became so possessive that she would reportedly refuse to leave her husband's side, even at court functions and diplomatic meetings, a behaviour that was considered a grave breach of royal protocol and a major embarrassment. The court, which once buzzed with life, now whispers behind cupped hands. The courtiers, both Flemish and Spanish, are caught in the middle of this domestic war. The Spanish retinue, Juana's ladies and advisers, are a constant source of reports back to her mother, Queen Isabella. And what they report is not good. They describe her as increasingly unstable, a woman who is not just jealous but truly unhinged. They chronicle her fits of melancholia, her long hours spent weeping alone, and her unpredictable rages. They see her behaviour as a sign of deep spiritual and mental illness, and they blame Philip's scandalous lifestyle for her decline. But a quirky tidbit about this period reveals a more complex picture. Some of her Spanish ladies-in-waiting, loyal to Queen Isabella, were themselves involved in a political conspiracy. They were actively trying to sow discord between Juana and Philip, hoping to undermine the Habsburg alliance and bring their princess back under the strict control of Castile. Whether Juana's jealousy was entirely her own or was fanned by these subtle provocations is a question that historians still debate. Was she a victim of her own passions, or was she a pawn in a game of political manipulation that was slowly driving her insane? It's a question that has no easy answer. You witness one of these scenes firsthand. A grand feast is being held in the palace, with music and dancing. Philip is, as usual, the centre of attention, laughing and flirting with the ladies of the court. Juana is watching from the corner, her eyes fixed on him, a haunted look on her face. Suddenly she sees him lean in and whisper something in the ear of a young, beautiful countess. Juana's face goes pale, and in a moment she's on her feet. She strides across the room, ignoring the gasps and stares, and confronts the countess. She doesn't just whisper, she shouts, her voice raw with hurt and fury. The music stops, the laughter dies. The room becomes a theatre of her personal anguish. This kind of public display is unheard of. A queen, a princess, is expected to maintain a stoic, serene demeanour. A royal marriage, no matter how troubled, is a matter of state, not personal emotion. Juana's inability or unwillingness to follow these rules is what truly sets her apart. She feels her pain too deeply, too publicly, and in a world where everything is a performance, she is a woman who has forgotten her lines. Her physical health begins to suffer as well. The constant emotional turmoil and lack of sleep lead to periods of deep exhaustion. She becomes withdrawn and apathetic, spending long hours in her rooms, refusing to eat or speak. Her once sharp and curious mind becomes cloudy. She struggles to concentrate, and her once brilliant command of languages seems to fade. Her love for her husband, the very thing that once brought her so much joy, has become a source of profound despair. Her mother, Queen Isabella, is growing increasingly concerned. The reports from the Spanish embassy in Brussels are alarming. Juana is no longer a political asset. She is a political liability. The Habsburgs, for their part, are also at a loss. Philip, exasperated by her behaviour, sometimes simply abandons her in a fit of pique, which only makes her worse. His family, particularly his father, Emperor Maximilian, is concerned about the stability of the Habsburg-Spanish alliance. The marriage was supposed to be a great triumph, and it is turning into a public relations nightmare. Historians still argue whether Juana's mental health was already fragile when she left Spain, or if it was the result of the immense psychological and emotional toll of her tumultuous marriage. It's a classic nature versus nurture debate. Was she born with a predisposition to mental illness, a trait that ran in her family? Or was the toxic environment of her marriage, the constant betrayal and public humiliation, the catalyst that drove her over the edge? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a combination of both. You see her, a ghost in her own life. She's surrounded by people, but she's utterly alone. She's the heir to a vast kingdom, but she has no power over her own life, her own emotions, or her own destiny. Her world, which was once so vibrant and full of promise, has shrunk to a single point: her husband. And as long as his devotion to her remains in question, she cannot find peace. This period is a slow descent into madness, not a sudden, dramatic break, but a gradual, inexorable slide. The small cracks you saw forming earlier are now gaping chasms. Her soul, which was once so bright and full of life, is being eclipsed by a long, cold shadow. The girl who was so full of questions and so eager to learn is now a woman lost in a labyrinth of her own pain and paranoia. And you know, with a sickening certainty, that this is only the beginning. The real tragedies are yet to come. The stage is being set for a series of events so shocking, so profound, that they will change the course of European history and cement Juana's place in the pantheon of history's most tragic figures. The fragile peace is about to be shattered, and the world is about to descend into a new kind of darkness. You're now in the year 1497, a year that will change Juana's life forever, and not in a good way. The private drama of her marriage is about to be eclipsed by a series of public tragedies that will thrust her into a position she was never meant to hold. The court of Castile is far away, across the same treacherous sea that brought her to Flanders, but the news when it arrives hits like a thunderbolt. First, a mainstream historical fact that shocked all of Europe: the death of Juana's only brother, Prince Juan. He was the sole male heir to the thrones of both Castile and Aragon, a young man who was seen as the future of Spain. He had been a sickly boy, but his death at the age of 19, just 6 months after his marriage to Margaret of Austria, Philip's sister, was sudden and devastating. His death not only shattered the hopes of 2 dynasties, it also had a profound effect on Juana's family. Her mother, Queen Isabella, was heartbroken. The line of succession now fell to Juan's wife, Margaret, who was rumoured to be pregnant. But the hope of a posthumous heir was dashed when she gave birth to a stillborn son. The male line of succession was dead. The weight of the crown now fell to Juana's older sister, Isabella, the Crown Princess of Portugal. But fate, it seems, was not done with this family. Isabella, a pious and gentle woman, was also in frail health. She gave birth to a son, Miguel, but died just an hour later, exhausted and in pain. The news when it reached the Habsburg court was a fresh blow. The line of succession had now skipped over 2 people and landed squarely on the shoulders of her nephew, the infant Miguel. But Miguel was a frail child, and his health was a constant source of anxiety. He too died at the tender age of 2 in the year 1500. With his death, the last male line claimant and the last viable alternative were gone. The unimaginable had happened. The line of succession had now bypassed all of her siblings and their children and landed with a sickening thud on Juana herself. You watch as the news of these successive deaths arrives. For the rest of the world, it is a matter of politics and succession. But for Juana, it is a personal tragedy of immense proportions. Her brother, her sister, and her nephew, all gone in a few short years. She's not just inheriting a throne, she's inheriting a legacy of loss. And this legacy, a quirky tidbit about her life, is something she takes deeply to heart. She feels a profound sense of responsibility and grief for the family she left behind. The emotional turmoil of her marriage is now compounded by a crushing new weight: the crown. The pressure on her is immense. Her father, Ferdinand, and her mother, Isabella, now see her not just as a daughter, but as a queen in waiting, the last hope for their dynasty. They begin to put pressure on her to return to Spain, to be formally recognised as the heir, to leave the decadent Habsburg court behind. Her husband, Philip, sees this as an opportunity for his own ambition. He's no longer just the Duke of a duchy. He's the prince consort of the most powerful kingdom in Europe. His ambition is palpable. He sees himself as a king, not just a duke, and he has no intention of being a subordinate to his wife's family. Historians still argue whether Philip's newfound ambition was a good or a bad thing for Juana. On the one hand, he was no longer just concerned with his own pleasures. He was now focused on a political goal. On the other hand, his ambition would lead him to make decisions that would put him at direct odds with her father, and in the middle of it all would be Juana, a woman already teetering on the brink. The deaths in her family did not bring her peace. They only added a new layer of psychological pressure to her already fragile state. You see her, a ghost of her former self, attending court functions with a haunted, distant look in her eyes. The constant fights with Philip continue, but now they are laced with a new kind of tension, the fight for power. Philip wants to be the ruler of Castile, and Ferdinand wants to make sure that Juana, and through her, he, remains in control. Juana, a woman who has no interest in politics, is now the central pawn in this grand game of thrones. Her parents, knowing her fragile state, send emissaries to bring her and Philip back to Spain for a formal recognition ceremony. It is a long, arduous journey by sea, a mirror of the one that took her away from home years ago. But this time, the journey is not filled with the naive hope of a young girl in love. It is filled with the dread of a woman returning to a world that she knows will try to swallow her whole. The seas are rough, the ships are crowded, and Juana, pregnant again, is miserable and ill. Her mental and physical state are deteriorating rapidly. The final straw for her and Philip's relationship comes during a stopover in England at the court of King Henry VII. Philip, always a lover of spectacle, is received with great pomp and circumstance. He charms the English court, but his constant flirting and late-night revelries send Juana into a fresh fit of jealousy. The last ounce of trust she had in him is shattered. She's now convinced that he is not just unfaithful, but that he is actively trying to poison her soul and undermine her in the eyes of the world. When she finally arrives in Spain, she is not the young woman who left years ago. She's a broken woman, a shadow of her former self. The royal court of her mother, which was so austere and pious, now feels like a prison. The people who once knew her as a bright philosophical girl now see her as Juana the Mad, a label that is already beginning to stick. She's a queen without a kingdom, a wife without a trusting heart, and a daughter caught between the two most powerful men in Europe. The stage is set for a final, tragic showdown. The death of her siblings and nephew, while a profound personal tragedy, was also the catalyst that would bring all of her problems to a head, forcing her to confront her future in a way she was not prepared for. You're now back on Spanish soil, and the air feels different. It's not the damp chill of Flanders, but the dry, dusty heat of Castile. It's 1502, and you are a witness to a momentous historical event. The Cortes, or Parliament of Castile, is being convened to formally recognise Juana as the heir to the throne. The ceremony is held in Toledo, a city of winding streets and ancient stone walls, and the atmosphere is a mix of solemn pageantry and palpable political tension. A mainstream historical fact is that Juana and Philip were publicly sworn in as the rightful heirs to the crown of Castile and Leon. The great nobles of the kingdom, the bishops, and the representatives of the towns all kneel before them, swearing fealty. For a brief moment it seems as though their shared destiny is being cemented, a future of shared rule over the most powerful kingdom in Europe. But as you observe the proceedings, you notice the subtle undercurrents of dissent and mistrust. The two men who stand on either side of Juana, her father Ferdinand and her husband Philip, are not allies, they are rivals. Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, is a master of political manoeuvring. He knows that his power in Castile is dependent on his wife, Queen Isabella. With Juana as his heir, he fears that his influence will wane, and he will be relegated to a secondary role. He wants to maintain control, and he sees Philip, with his Habsburg ambitions and his arrogant demeanour, as a direct threat. Philip, for his part, sees himself not as a mere consort, but as a king in his own right. He has brought his own ambitious courtiers with him, and they are already making a power play, trying to secure their positions and their fortunes in the new kingdom. Juana, in the middle of it all, is a ghost. She's pale and withdrawn, her eyes distant. She speaks little, and when she does, her voice is often a low, barely audible whisper. The joy and passion that once animated her are gone, replaced by a deep-seated melancholy and a quiet despair. She is a queen, yes, but you can feel that she has no real power. She is a pawn being moved between two powerful warring factions. A quirky tidbit about this period is that during the Cortes, Juana was pregnant with her fifth child, Ferdinand, who would later become Holy Roman Emperor. The court was in a state of constant anxiety about her health, not just physical, but mental. Her emotional state was a barometer for the political climate. When she was melancholic, it was a sign of a troubled court. When she showed a flicker of anger, it was seen as a sign of her unreliability. Her mental state was not just a personal matter, it was a matter of state. The tension between Ferdinand and Philip is a physical thing, a heavy weight in the air. Philip, frustrated by the slow pace of Spanish politics and the rigid Spanish court, clashes constantly with his father-in-law. Philip wants to return to Flanders, to his more liberal and cosmopolitan court. He sees Spain as provincial and stifling. Ferdinand, however, wants them to remain in Spain, where he can keep an eye on them. The power struggle is not just about the throne, it's about a clash of cultures, of temperaments, and of ambitions. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's actions in this period were motivated by a genuine concern for his daughter's well-being, or if they were a calculated attempt to seize power. There is no easy answer. He was, by all accounts, a loving father in his own way, but he was also a ruthless and Machiavellian politician. He saw his daughter's emotional fragility not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. He could use her mental state as a pretext to assume control of her kingdom, to rule in her name, and to sideline his ambitious son-in-law. The public perception of Juana as mad was a useful tool in his political arsenal. You watch as the conflict comes to a head. Philip, unable to stand the oppressive atmosphere any longer, decides to leave. He makes the decision to return to Flanders, but he does so without Juana, claiming that her emotional state and her pregnancy make the journey too difficult for her. Juana, desperate and heartbroken, begs him not to go. She throws herself at his feet, pleading with him, but he is unmoved. He sees her emotional display as another sign of her instability, and he leaves her behind, taking their eldest son Charles, the future Emperor Charles V, with him. The scene is a public humiliation for Juana. Her husband, the one person she truly loved, has abandoned her. Her father, the man who is supposed to be her protector, stands by and watches. She's left to face the court alone, her personal anguish now a public spectacle. The once passionate Juana is now a woman lost in a sea of grief and betrayal. Her husband's departure is the final, crushing blow. It confirms all of her deepest fears and insecurities. This moment is a pivotal turning point in her life. She is now utterly alone, caught between two powerful men who are using her as a weapon against each other. She is the queen of a kingdom, but she is a prisoner of her own emotions and the political machinations of her family. She is stripped of her agency, her voice, and her sanity. The public facade of a happy, powerful couple has been shattered, and in its place is a reality of betrayal, power struggles, and profound personal tragedy. Juana, left alone in Castile, sinks deeper into her depression. She refuses to speak to anyone, spending her days in a state of melancholic silence. Her mother, Queen Isabella, attempts to console her, but her attempts are in vain. The mother and daughter are too different, and the chasm between them is too great. Isabella sees her daughter's pain as a weakness of faith. Juana sees her mother's piety as a form of emotional suppression. The two women, so alike in their strength of will, are now on opposite sides of a profound personal and psychological divide. The stage is set for the final act of this tragic drama, the moment when Juana will finally be stripped of all her power and relegated to the footnotes of history as the Mad Queen. You are now a fly on the wall in the court of Queen Isabella. It's late 1504, and the air is thick with grief and political intrigue. Isabella, the formidable queen who forged a unified Spain, is on her deathbed. Her last act is to formalise her will. A mainstream historical fact is that in her will, she named Juana as her heir to the throne of Castile, with Philip as her co-ruler. But there was a critical caveat. The will stipulated that if Juana was deemed incapable of ruling, her father Ferdinand would take over as regent. This was the ultimate political insurance policy, a safety net that Juana's parents had woven in anticipation of her emotional fragility. For Juana, who had been abandoned by her husband and was sinking deeper into a state of melancholia, this was not a vote of confidence, but an explicit statement of mistrust. You watch as Juana, haggard and emotionally drained, sits by her mother's side. She's present for the signing of the will, but she seems to be in a daze, a silent observer of her own fate being sealed. She's the queen in name, but her power is already being siphoned away. The will, a legal document, is now the ultimate weapon in the political chess match between her father and her husband. And the match begins the moment Queen Isabella breathes her last. The news of her death spreads like wildfire across Europe. Ferdinand, now the King of Aragon, is left in a precarious position. He is no longer the consort of Castile, but a king of a separate kingdom. His power in Castile is dependent on his daughter's good graces, and he knows that Philip, Juana's ambitious husband, will not be so gracious. He knows that Philip will use Juana's mental state as a pretext to seize power and push him out. But Ferdinand is not a man to be outmanoeuvred. He immediately begins a campaign of political deception. He uses the clause in Isabella's will as his justification, and he writes letters to the European courts, detailing Juana's incapacity to rule. He paints a picture of a mad queen, a woman who is not fit to govern a kingdom. A quirky tidbit is that he even commissioned a series of reports from Juana's own Spanish ladies-in-waiting, who, eager to please the king, provided exaggerated and sensational accounts of her erratic behaviour, including her refusal to eat and her long periods of silence. Philip, meanwhile, has heard the news of Isabella's death and sees his chance. He immediately sets sail for Spain with a large fleet, ready to claim his crown. He knows that Ferdinand is a formidable opponent, but he believes that Juana, being his wife, will ultimately side with him. The two men, father and son-in-law, are on a collision course, and Juana, the fragile, heartbroken queen, is caught in the middle. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand was a villain or a pragmatist in this scenario. Was he genuinely trying to protect his kingdom from a potentially unstable ruler? Or was he simply using his daughter's illness as a pretext to hold on to power? The truth is probably a mix of both. He loved his daughter, in his own way, but his love for power was even greater. He had spent his entire life building a unified kingdom, and he was not about to let it fall into the hands of a flighty foreign prince. You watch as Philip's fleet arrives in Spain. The meeting between the two men is cold and tense. Philip demands to be recognised as King of Castile, but Ferdinand refuses. The standoff is now a full-blown crisis. Juana, a figurehead in her own kingdom, is now forced to choose between her father and her husband. The choice is impossible. She loves them both, in her own way, but they are both using her as a pawn. In a moment that must have been agonising for her, she sides with her husband. She declares that he is her king, and she signs a document that would allow him to be named co-ruler. But the document is a sham. Ferdinand, with his vast network of spies and informants, has already been in contact with the Castilian nobles, promising them land and titles in exchange for their loyalty. He has also been quietly spreading the word that Juana is not fit to rule, and that her husband is an ambitious foreigner who would bleed the kingdom dry. The political manoeuvring is breathtaking in its ruthlessness. Ferdinand and Philip meet in a town called Villafafila, and they sign a document that is known as the Concord of Villafafila. A mainstream historical fact is that this document was a political masterpiece of deceit. It formally recognised Philip as King of Castile, but it also declared Juana's incapacity to rule. It was a win for Philip, but it was a devastating loss for Juana, as it enshrined her mental illness in a legal document, a kind of permanent and public humiliation. It was a formal acknowledgement that she was unfit to govern. Ferdinand, however, was not done. He immediately retired to his kingdom of Aragon, claiming that he would not interfere in Castile's affairs. But he left behind a network of spies and loyalists, all waiting for the right moment to strike. He had, in essence, handed the crown to Philip, but he had also set the stage for his son-in-law's downfall. He knew that Philip, without his steady hand to guide him, would make mistakes, and he was right. Juana, for her part, seems to have been completely oblivious to the political machinations surrounding her. She was a woman lost in a private hell of grief and paranoia. Her husband was now a king, and she was a queen, but their shared triumph was built on a foundation of deceit and betrayal. She was not a partner in power. She was a symbol of her own demise. She was the Queen of Castile, but she had been stripped of her power, her agency, and her dignity. Her crown had been stolen not by a rival kingdom, but by the two men who were supposed to protect her. The stage is now set for the final tragic act of her husband's life, an act that will forever change the course of her own. You are now in the year 1506, in the city of Burgos, Castile. The air is thick with a different kind of tension. Philip has, for now, won. He's the King of Castile, having effectively sidelined his father-in-law Ferdinand, who has retreated to his kingdom of Aragon. But Philip's victory is a hollow one. He has the crown, but his queen, Juana, is now a shadow of her former self. The constant political turmoil and the psychological toll of her marriage have left her in a state of deep clinical depression. A mainstream historical fact is that she would often refuse to eat, sleep, or speak for days on end. Her grief and her paranoia are now an all-consuming force, a storm that rages inside of her, visible to all who see her. You watch as Philip tries to govern. He's not a man of patience or diplomacy. He's used to the more relaxed, pleasure-seeking court of Flanders, and he finds the rigid, formal court of Castile stifling. His arrogance and his foreign manners alienate the local nobles. He promotes his own Flemish courtiers to positions of power, a move that angers the Spanish elite. He is a king, yes, but he is a king without a kingdom's love. The nobles, who had once sided with him against Ferdinand, are now beginning to have second thoughts. They see that Philip is not a ruler who will bring stability. He is a ruler who will bring chaos. And in the centre of it all is Juana. Philip, in a calculated move, keeps her close. He knows that his claim to the throne is through her, and he needs her to be a visible, if silent, presence. But her mental state makes this a challenge. She is erratic and unpredictable. A quirky tidbit about this period is that she would often wander the palace halls at night, muttering to herself, her hair unkempt, her clothes in disarray. She was a queen who had lost all interest in her appearance, a shocking state of affairs for a royal. Her body, once a source of beauty and passion for Philip, is now a vessel of her suffering. Her lack of hygiene, which would later become a defining characteristic of her image, is already beginning to take hold. It is an outward manifestation of her internal turmoil, a rejection of the world that has so deeply wounded her. Philip tries to control her. He places her under the care of his own physicians and courtiers, effectively making her a royal prisoner in her own home. Her Spanish retinue, the ladies-in-waiting who had been with her since her childhood, are either dismissed or marginalised. She is surrounded by people who are loyal to her husband, not to her. She is a queen in name, but in practice, she is a captive, a valuable political asset to be managed and contained. Historians still argue whether Philip's treatment of Juana was born of genuine concern for her well-being, or if it was a calculated move to isolate her and prevent her from communicating with her father, Ferdinand. It's a complex and painful question. He was in his own way a prisoner of his ambition, and she was a casualty of it. He needed her to be a functional queen, but her illness made that impossible, and so he chose the only path he saw available: control. He would rule in her name, and he would keep her locked away both physically and psychologically, a queen in a gilded cage. You see her, a ghost in the palace. She is a mother, yes, and she has children, but she seems unable to connect with them. Her mind is too consumed by her pain, her grief, her paranoia. The children are left to the care of their nurses and tutors, and they too are witnesses to their mother's decline. Her eldest son Charles, the future Holy Roman Emperor, will grow up with the memory of a mother who was a distant, melancholic figure, a woman who was a source of both love and profound sadness. Philip, meanwhile, is having a difficult time. The Spanish nobles, now disillusioned with him, are beginning to talk to Ferdinand, who is patiently waiting in Aragon, biding his time. Philip is a man of charm and charisma, but he lacks his father-in-law's political cunning and his mother-in-law's firm hand. He is a king, but he does not know how to rule. He is a master of the courtly arts, but he is a novice in the art of war and diplomacy. He is losing control, and he knows it. He's a man who has always gotten what he wanted, but this time the prize, the crown of Castile, is turning to dust in his hands. And then, just as the political situation is reaching a breaking point, the unthinkable happens. It is September of 1506. Philip, a man in the prime of his life, a vigorous young king, falls ill. The symptoms are sudden and severe. A high fever, a terrible stomachache, a deep malaise. A mainstream historical fact is that he dies just a few weeks later, at the age of 28, from what was likely typhoid fever, though rumours of poisoning were rampant at the time. The shock of his death reverberates across Europe. The King of Castile, the handsome, charming, ambitious Philip, is dead. Juana, his wife, is utterly and completely devastated. The man who had been the source of all her joy and all her pain is now gone. The one person she truly loved, the one person she was so pathologically attached to, is no longer in her life. The final, crushing blow has been dealt. The world, which had been so cruel to her, has now taken the last thing she had left to hold on to. The stage is set for the most macabre and bizarre act of her life. The grief that had been simmering for years now erupts into a full-blown public spectacle of sorrow and madness. The world has seen Juana the Mad in private. Now the world is about to see her on the road, with her dead husband in tow, and you, a silent witness, are about to embark on the strangest funeral procession in history. You're standing in the palace of Burgos, and a hushed funereal silence has fallen over the court. The impossible has happened. King Philip has died. The man who was so full of life and charm, the man who was Juana's great love and her greatest tormentor, is gone. The shock is palpable. Courtiers move like ghosts, their faces pale with grief and fear. But for Juana, the grief is not a quiet thing. It is a scream that echoes through the halls, a raw, primal expression of a heart that has been shattered beyond repair. A mainstream historical fact is that Juana was so overcome with sorrow that she refused to be parted from her husband's body. She would not allow him to be embalmed, a standard practice for a king, and she would not allow his body to be taken to the royal crypt. Instead, she demanded that he be laid out in a coffin in a special chamber of the palace, where she would sit with him day and night. This was not a short vigil. This was an extended macabre act of devotion. She would not eat, she would not sleep, and she would not speak to anyone. She was a woman frozen in a moment of profound grief. You watch as her courtiers, both Spanish and Flemish, try to reason with her. They plead with her to allow the funeral to proceed, to allow the body to be prepared for burial, but she is immovable. She stares at them with eyes that seem to see nothing, and she whispers that her husband is not dead, that he is only sleeping. She orders that the coffin be opened so she can look upon his face, a ritual she would perform every single day. This is a crucial and deeply disturbing part of her story. She was not just mourning him, she was trying to deny his death, to hold on to the last physical remnants of a man who had consumed her life. The court of Castile is now in a state of chaos. With the king dead and the queen incapacitated by grief, there is a power vacuum. The nobles who had once sided with Philip are now looking to Ferdinand, who is still in Aragon, waiting for his moment. And Juana, the queen who is meant to rule them, is a figure of pity and dread. Her behaviour is not just seen as a sign of grief, it is seen as proof of her madness. The whispers that have been following her for years have now become a chorus. The Mad Queen. The label has been cemented in the public consciousness. A quirky tidbit about this period is that Juana reportedly kept Philip's body above ground for an extended period, and some accounts even suggest she would put her hands on his body, a morbid ritual that horrified her courtiers. She would reportedly comb his hair, arrange his clothes, and even speak to him as if he were still alive. Her grief was so powerful, so all-consuming, that it blurred the line between life and death. She was a woman who had lost everything, and she was clinging to the one thing she had left, the physical presence of the man she loved. This long, morbid vigil is a testament to the depth of her love for him. This was not a love that was healthy or sane. It was a love that was pathological, a powerful obsession that was born of a deep-seated insecurity and a profound need for affection. Philip had been the first person who had ever truly seen her, who had ever truly loved her, and with his death, a part of her had died as well. Historians still argue whether her behaviour was a manifestation of a pre-existing mental illness or a genuine psychological breakdown brought on by extreme grief. It is a difficult question to answer. There is evidence that she had a genetic predisposition to mental illness, but there is also evidence that her tumultuous life, her abandonment by her husband, and the political machinations of her family were the ultimate catalyst that pushed her over the edge. Her grief was real, but it was also a public spectacle, and it was used by her father to his own advantage. Ferdinand, ever the pragmatist, sees his chance. He immediately writes to the Castilian nobles, promising to return to Castile and govern as regent in his daughter's name. He frames his return not as a power grab, but as a selfless act of a father trying to help his suffering daughter and a king trying to bring stability to his kingdom. He is, of course, doing both. He is a master of political spin, and he knows exactly how to use his daughter's illness to his advantage. Juana, in her grief, is a force of nature. She refuses to be moved. When her courtiers try to convince her to allow the body to be moved to the royal crypt, she threatens them with violence. When her father, Ferdinand, sends emissaries to her, she refuses to speak to them. She's a woman who has lost her voice, but she still has her will. She's a queen, and she will not be moved. And so, for months, the strange vigil continues. The court of Castile is at a standstill. The nobles are in a state of anxiety, and Juana is lost in a private world of sorrow and delusion. The love that once brought her so much joy has now become a source of profound suffering. The passion that once made her a queen has now made her a prisoner. And the death of her husband, the man who was both her soulmate and her betrayer, has been the final crushing blow. The stage is now set for a journey so strange, so macabre, that it will forever cement her place in the annals of history. The funeral procession is about to begin, and it will be unlike any funeral procession the world has ever seen. You are now a part of the strangest funeral procession in the history of Europe. It is late 1506, and the mournful trek has finally begun. After months of her obstinate refusal to part with her husband's body, Juana has finally agreed to allow the funeral to proceed. But her agreement comes with a set of bizarre and non-negotiable conditions. A mainstream historical fact is that she insisted that Philip's coffin not be buried immediately in the royal crypt, but instead be taken on a long, slow journey across Castile to Granada, the final resting place of her parents. This was not a direct route. It was a pilgrimage of sorrow, a macabre procession that would last for years, with a single unshakable purpose: to keep her beloved Philip close to her, forever on the road. The procession itself is a spectacle of profound melancholy. Juana, a figure cloaked in black, rides in a carriage that follows the heavy ornate coffin. The carriage is a silent mobile prison, and inside she is a ghost. Her hair is unkempt, her clothes are stained and dishevelled, and her eyes are hollow with grief. She's a queen who has lost all interest in her own appearance, a fact that is both a sign of her profound emotional distress and a source of scandal for her courtiers. Her refusal to bathe or change her clothes earns her the reputation for being the stinkiest queen of the Middle Ages, a cruel and poignant label that speaks to the depth of her suffering. The procession travels exclusively at night. Juana has a deep-seated fear of daylight, a belief that her sorrow is a secret meant only for the darkness. She orders the procession to stop at every village and town where the coffin is to be placed in the local church, and a mass is to be said for the soul of her husband. She, however, would not enter the churches herself, preferring to stay with the coffin in the shadows outside, as if she was guarding him from the world. A quirky tidbit about this journey is that she would sometimes order the coffin to be opened, so she could look upon her husband's face, a ritual that horrified her courtiers. She was not just a grieving widow, she was a woman trying to keep the last remnants of her love alive, a living monument to a dead man. The courtiers, both Spanish and Flemish, are miserable. The journey is long, cold and slow. They are constantly on the move, but they are also constantly at a standstill. They are a court without a home, a royal retinue without a king to serve. They are caught between a living queen who is a ghost and a dead king who is an obsession. They are a part of a bizarre living nightmare, a funeral procession that has no end in sight. And the rumours, of course, follow them everywhere. The peasants in the villages and towns who have never seen a queen so broken whisper of her madness. They tell stories of a woman who is so consumed by grief that she has lost her mind. They say that she talks to the coffin, that she sings lullabies to it, that she weeps over it at night. The stories, while rooted in a tragic reality, are also embellished and exaggerated, and they serve to cement her reputation as Juana the Mad. Historians still argue whether her behaviour on this journey was a conscious choice, or a product of her mental illness. Was she deliberately trying to send a message to her father, Ferdinand, that she was in charge, that she would not be moved? Or was she simply a woman who had completely lost her mind and had no control over her actions? The truth is likely a combination of both. Her grief was real, but she was also a woman of great stubbornness and a strong will, and this journey was her way of asserting her control over the one thing she had left, her husband's body. She was a queen who had no power over her kingdom, so she took power over her dead king. The journey is not without its challenges. The roads are rough, the weather is unpredictable, and the people are in a state of deep anxiety about their new queen. Juana, in her grief, is a political liability. Her actions are being used by her father, Ferdinand, to justify his return to power. He's telling the nobles of Castile that their queen is unfit to rule, that she's a danger to herself and to the kingdom. He's framing his return not as a power grab, but as an act of mercy, a way to save his daughter and his kingdom from themselves. The procession finally reaches a convent in a remote area, and Juana, exhausted and ill, decides to stay for a while. It is a temporary respite, a moment of stillness in a journey that has been nothing but motion. But the quiet does not bring her peace. She is still a woman in mourning, a woman who is a prisoner of her own heart. She spends her days in a state of quiet despair, her only companion the coffin of her husband. This journey, this strange, heartbreaking pilgrimage, is the defining image of Juana's life. It is the moment where she ceases to be a person and becomes a legend, a symbol of a love so intense it bordered on insanity. She is the mad queen with the dead king, a figure of tragedy and pity, and you, as you watch her from the shadows, know that this is not a journey that will end in peace. It is a journey that will end in a final and permanent prison. The road has been long, but the destination, a castle where she will spend the rest of her life, is just over the horizon. The funeral procession is almost over, but the suffering is just beginning. The funeral procession of King Philip continues, and you, a shadow in its wake, witness the growing public spectacle of Juana's grief. The slow, nighttime journey across Castile is not just a pilgrimage, it is a travelling circus of sorrow, a living legend in the making. The whispers that once followed Juana have now become loud, confident stories told by peasants around their fireplaces and by nobles in their courts. The narrative of Juana the Mad is no longer a private theory, it is a public fact. A mainstream historical fact is that during this long, meandering journey, the rumours of Juana's bizarre behaviour became so widespread that her father, Ferdinand, was able to use them as a powerful political tool. He would send emissaries to the towns where she was staying, and they would return with sensational accounts of her mental state, which Ferdinand would then share with the Castilian nobles. He painted a picture of a queen who was not just grieving, but who was a danger to herself and to the kingdom. He was not just spreading rumours, he was crafting a public relations campaign, a masterclass in political manipulation. You see Juana, a figure of profound pity, as the procession stops in a small village. The villagers, awed by the sight of the royal cortege, watch from a respectful distance. A quirky tidbit about this period is that Juana would sometimes order her courtiers to place the coffin in an open field, where she would sit beside it for hours staring into the sky. She would talk to the coffin as if it were still a living person, and she would weep and wail for her lost love. This was not a private act, it was a public spectacle, and the villagers, who had never seen such a raw display of emotion from a royal, were both fascinated and horrified. Her refusal to enter churches, her demand to travel only at night, her constant weeping, all of these things were not just signs of her grief, they were also a source of great confusion and fear for the people of Castile. In a deeply Catholic society, a queen who refused to pray in a church and who wandered in the darkness was seen not just as mad, but as possibly possessed. The local priests, unable to reason with her, would perform special masses for her soul, hoping to drive out whatever dark force had taken hold of her. Historians still argue whether the rumours of her madness were a complete fabrication, a political tool wielded by her father, or if they were an accurate, if exaggerated, description of her genuine mental state. There is no doubt that Ferdinand used her illness to his advantage. He had a powerful motive to sideline her and take control of the kingdom. But there is also no doubt that Juana was suffering from a profound mental illness. Her behaviour was not that of a sane, well-adjusted person. It was the behaviour of a woman who was in deep emotional distress. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. A genuine illness that was cynically and expertly exploited for political gain. The procession, in its slow, agonising pace, is a powerful symbol of Juana's psychological state. She's stuck in the past, unable to move forward. The constant motion of the journey is a physical manifestation of her mental turmoil, a body in motion while the mind is in a state of stasis. She's a woman who is both here and not here, a queen who is both alive and dead. She's a prisoner of her own grief, a ghost in her own life. The courtiers, meanwhile, are at their wits' end. They are tired, cold, and hungry. They are a court without a home, a group of people who are being forced to follow a woman who has no destination in mind. They try to reason with her, to convince her to go to a proper royal palace, to put an end to this macabre procession. But she refuses, threatening to kill herself if they try to part her from her husband. She's a woman of great stubbornness, and her grief has made her a formidable opponent. The constant stops, the unhygienic conditions, and the public spectacle of Juana's suffering are a source of great embarrassment for the Spanish nobility. They see her not as a queen, but as a public scandal, a stain on the royal family's reputation. They begin to actively work with Ferdinand, promising their loyalty in exchange for a return to normalcy. They want a king who will rule, a queen who will be a dignified presence, and a court that is not a travelling funeral. And Juana, oblivious to the political machinations swirling around her, continues her long, sorrowful journey. She's a woman who is lost in her own private hell, a hell that she has made public for all the world to see. The love that once brought her so much joy is now a source of profound suffering. Her passion has become her prison, and the whispers that once followed her are now a loud, confident chorus, a public verdict on her sanity. The journey is nearing its end, but the suffering is not. The destination, a remote castle in Castile, is not a home, but a final, permanent prison. The royal cortege, a travelling monument to grief, continues its surreal journey through the Castilian countryside. The procession, moving only at night, has become a legend in its own time. You are now a part of this bizarre pilgrimage, a witness to Juana's unshakable devotion and the profound public oddness of her behaviour. A mainstream historical fact is that the journey was not a direct route to Granada. Juana, in a fit of inexplicable impulse, would sometimes change her mind and order the procession to turn around, doubling back on a path already travelled, or suddenly change direction to an obscure village. She was not just a grieving widow, she was an unpredictable force of nature, a queen who was making a political statement with her very motion, a rebellion of grief against the world. The logistical challenges of this journey are immense. The courtiers and guards, exhausted and demoralised, are forced to navigate the rough, unpaved roads in the darkness. They are constantly at the mercy of Juana's whims. A quirky tidbit about this time is that the procession, in a particularly muddy season, got so bogged down in the mud that it came to a complete standstill for days, and Juana, refusing to abandon the coffin, simply stayed with it, ignoring the pleas of her courtiers. She was a woman who was no longer concerned with the comforts of a palace. Her only purpose was to be with her beloved. Her lack of hygiene, which was by now a permanent state, only added to the misery of those around her. The constant stops in the small remote villages and towns are a source of both wonder and horror for the local populace. The peasants, who have never seen a coffin so grand or a queen so broken, are a constant audience for her grief. They whisper stories of her, a mad queen who is travelling with a dead king, a woman who is so consumed by sorrow that she has lost her mind. These stories, fueled by a mixture of fact and folklore, serve to cement her reputation and to make her a figure of both pity and dread. The journey is not just a funeral procession. It is a travelling theatre of her private anguish, a spectacle for a kingdom that is holding its breath. The coffin itself, heavy and ornate, is the centrepiece of the drama. It is a symbol of her devotion, a physical manifestation of her psychological state. She would not allow it to be placed in a church that housed women, a reflection of her deep-seated jealousy and paranoia. She was afraid, even in death, that her husband would be taken from her. She would reportedly stand guard over the coffin at night, a lone figure in the darkness, a protector of a dead man. This was not a healthy grief. This was an obsession, a pathological attachment that had consumed her entire being. The political ramifications of this journey are immense. Her father, Ferdinand, who is patiently waiting in Aragon, is using the procession as his ultimate political weapon. He is telling the Castilian nobles that their queen is unfit to rule, that her behaviour is a danger to the kingdom. He is framing his return as a reluctant act, a selfless sacrifice for the good of his people. He is using his daughter's illness to seize power, and the journey, this bizarre public spectacle, is his justification. Historians still argue whether Juana's bizarre behaviour was an act of rebellion against her father and the Castilian court, a way of asserting her autonomy in the only way she knew how. Was she deliberately trying to sabotage her father's plans, to prove that she was a queen who could not be controlled? Or was she simply a woman who had completely lost her mind and had no idea of the political consequences of her actions? The truth is a complex and nuanced thing. Her grief was real, but it was also a weapon, a form of protest against a world that had so deeply betrayed her. The procession finally makes it to the outskirts of a town, and Juana, for the first time in months, agrees to stop at a convent. It is a moment of stillness, a temporary respite from the constant motion. She's exhausted and ill, and the courtiers who are at their wits' end are relieved. But the quiet does not bring her peace. She is still a woman in mourning, a woman who is a prisoner of her own heart. She is a queen who has lost everything, and her only companion is the coffin of her husband. This strange pilgrimage is coming to an end. The years-long journey, the nighttime travel, the bizarre rituals, all of it is now coming to a close. The destination, a remote castle in the Castilian countryside, is not a home, but a final, permanent prison. The funeral procession is almost over, but the suffering is just beginning. The road has been long, but the destination, a castle where she will spend the rest of her life, is just over the horizon. The funeral procession is almost over, but the suffering is just beginning. She's a queen without a kingdom, a wife without a husband, and a woman without a home. The world has seen Juana the Mad on the road. Now it is about to see her in a cage. The strange pilgrimage of Juana and her dead husband has, for the time being, come to a stop. The procession is now camped out near the monastery of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, a small dusty town in Castile. The year is 1507, and the political situation is as tense as ever. Her father, Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, has returned to Castile and is now ruling as regent in her name. He is, by all accounts, a master of political spin, and he has used his daughter's bizarre behaviour to cement his claim to power. But the story of Juana's life is not just a political one. It is also a deeply personal one, a story of a family torn apart by power, betrayal, and mental illness. You're about to witness a scene that is both heartbreaking and pivotal. The meeting between a grieving mother and her rebellious daughter, Isabella. A mainstream historical fact is that Juana had several children, and a quirky tidbit about her life is that while on her bizarre journey with Philip's coffin, she was also caring for her youngest daughter, Catalina. She was, in a strange way, both a devoted mother and a woman who was completely lost to her grief. Her daughter, Catalina, was a constant companion on the journey, a small child who was witness to her mother's profound sorrow and her strange rituals. You see them together, Juana cloaked in black, her eyes hollow, and Catalina, a small innocent child clinging to her mother's hand. The contrast is both poignant and heartbreaking. The relationship between Juana and her mother, Queen Isabella, was a complex and strained one. Isabella was a woman of deep faith and unshakable will. She was a warrior queen who had no patience for weakness or emotional excess. She saw her daughter's passionate nature not as a sign of a deep, loving soul, but as a sign of a deep spiritual flaw. She had tried to mould her daughter into a perfect, pious princess, and she had failed. And Juana, for her part, had never been able to live up to her mother's impossible standards. But the relationship between Juana and her own daughter, Isabella, was different. Isabella was Juana's eldest daughter, born in 1498. She was a quiet, serious girl, and she was the only one of Juana's children who seemed to have a genuine connection with her. She was a source of comfort to Juana in her darkest moments, a living reminder of the happy times with Philip. When Juana was at her most withdrawn and melancholic, Isabella would sit with her, holding her hand and talking to her in a quiet, calming voice. You watch as the two of them, mother and daughter, are in a temporary residence near the monastery. Juana, a shadow of her former self, is sitting in a darkened room, and her daughter, a young girl of about 12, is sitting beside her, reading from a book of hours. It is a moment of quiet peace, a small flickering light in a world of profound darkness. But the peace is about to be shattered. Her father, Ferdinand, who has now firmly established himself as the ruler of Castile, wants to get Juana's children away from her. He sees them as a political asset, and he knows that if he can raise them, he can ensure his own power. But he also has a genuine concern for their well-being. He sees Juana's grief and her unhygienic state, and he worries about the effect it is having on his grandchildren. He sends emissaries to Juana, pleading with her to allow him to take the children, but she refuses. They are the only thing she has left, and she will not part with them. The conflict between a father's duty and a mother's grief is now a full-blown crisis. Ferdinand is a man who is used to getting his way, and he is not about to be stopped by his daughter's emotional state. He sends a large armed retinue to the monastery, and they take the children by force. The scene is a horrific one. Juana, a woman who is already on the brink of a complete breakdown, is now being stripped of her most precious possessions. She screams and wails. She throws herself on the floor. She begs and pleads. But her pleas are in vain. Her children, her last connection to the world, are being taken from her. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's actions were an act of cruelty or an act of mercy. Was he trying to protect his grandchildren from a mother who was a danger to them? Or was he simply using their well-being as a pretext to seize complete control of the kingdom? The truth is likely a combination of both. He was a ruthless and pragmatic politician, but he was also a man who had lost his own wife and son, and he understood the profound grief that Juana was experiencing. He may have believed, in his own way, that he was doing the right thing. The loss of her children is the final crushing blow. Juana, a woman who had already lost her husband, her kingdom, and her mind, has now lost her children. She is a queen who has been stripped of everything, and in her grief, she makes a decision that will forever change her life. She agrees to a final permanent resting place for her husband's body. The procession will now go to its final, and its only destination. The journey is over, but the suffering is not. The destination A remote castle in the Castilian countryside is not a home but a final permanent prison. The funeral procession is almost over, but the suffering is just beginning. The road has been long, but the destination, a castle where she will spend the rest of her life, is just over the horizon. The funeral procession is almost over, but the suffering is just beginning. She's a queen without a kingdom, a wife without a husband, and a woman without a home. The world has seen Juana the Mad on the road. Now it is about to see her in a cage. The bizarre years-long funeral procession has finally reached its end. You, a silent witness to Juana's slow descent, are now standing at the gates of the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas. The convent, once a place of quiet contemplation, is about to become a prison. A mainstream historical fact is that in 1509, her father, King Ferdinand, took his daughter to this very place, a location chosen not for its spiritual solace, but for its isolation and its strategic location near a major river, making any escape virtually impossible. This was not a move of mercy. It was a final and permanent act of political containment. You watch as Juana, now a ghost of her former self, is led into the convent. Her clothes are still in disarray, her hair unkempt, and her eyes hollow with grief. She's a queen who has lost everything, and she's now being stripped of the last thing she had left, her freedom. The convent is not just a building, it is a cage, and Juana is its most valuable prisoner. Ferdinand, ever the pragmatist, has a deep concern for his own power, and he knows that as long as his daughter is alive, she is a threat. A quirky tidbit about this period is that Ferdinand himself was now remarried, and had a young son, which provided an additional if unofficial reason for him to sideline Juana permanently. His new family had a claim to the throne, and Juana, the rightful queen, was a constant and dangerous reminder of their precarious position. Inside the convent, Juana is given a small, sparsely furnished room. She's allowed a few servants, but they are all handpicked by Ferdinand's men, loyal to the crown, and not to her. She's not allowed to receive visitors, and her communication with the outside world is severely restricted. She's a queen who is both present and absent, a political pawn who's been taken off the board. She's a woman who has lost her voice, and she will now spend the next 46 years of her life in a state of almost complete silence. The long years in Tordesillas are a testament to the depth of her despair. She would spend her days in her room, refusing to eat or speak. She would sit in the darkness, her face turned to the wall, a silent monument to her profound sadness. She was a queen without a kingdom, a wife without a husband, and a woman without a home. Her only companion, for a time, was the coffin of her husband, which had also been brought to the convent. The sight of it was a constant reminder of her grief, a physical manifestation of her psychological state. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's decision to imprison his daughter was an act of genuine cruelty or a necessary evil for the stability of the kingdom. Some argue that he was a ruthless tyrant who used his daughter's illness to seize power. Others argue that he was a pragmatic ruler who saw that Juana's mental state was a danger to the kingdom, and that her imprisonment was the only way to ensure peace. The truth, as is often the case, is a complex and nuanced thing. He was a man who loved his family in his own way, but his love for power was even greater. He had spent his entire life building a unified kingdom, and he was not about to let it fall into the hands of a woman who was a danger to herself and to the state. The years passed slowly in the convent. Juana's children grew up without her, raised by their grandfather Ferdinand. Her son, Charles, would become the most powerful ruler in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, and a king of a vast empire that spanned the globe. But Juana, his mother, was a forgotten queen, a tragic figure who was locked away in a small town in Castile. The world outside the convent continued to spin. Wars were fought, empires were built, and the course of history was changed forever. But inside the convent, time had stopped. Juana was a woman frozen in a moment of profound grief, a silent queen in a world that had forgotten her. She was a tragic figure, a woman who had been loved too deeply and who had been hurt too badly. She was a queen who was both present and absent, a political pawn who had been taken off the board. She was a woman who had lost her voice, and she would now spend the next 46 years of her life in a state of almost complete silence. The convent was not just a prison, it was a living tomb, a final and permanent resting place for a woman who was a queen in name, but a prisoner in practice. The stage is now set for a final and surprising act of her life, an act that will remind the world that she was still a queen, even in her cage. You are now a witness to the slow, agonizing passage of time. The years bleed into one another in the royal convent of Santa Clara at Tordesillas, and the outside world, with its wars and its empires, seems to fade into a distant hum. Juana, once a passionate princess and a grief-stricken queen on the road, has now become a permanent fixture of the castle, a living ghost in a stone cage. A mainstream historical fact is that she lived in the convent for 46 years, from 1509 until her death in 1555. This was not a life of royal comfort. It was a life of profound solitude and seclusion, a silent testimony to a mind that had been broken by grief and betrayal. Her physical state, which had already deteriorated on the road, continued its decline. Her refusal to bathe, to change her clothes, and to eat properly became a permanent state of being. She was, by all accounts, a woman of deep and profound sadness. She would often sit in the darkness of her room, refusing to speak to anyone, her face a mask of melancholic silence. She was a queen who had lost all interest in the world, a woman who had been stripped of her purpose and her dignity. A quirky tidbit about this period is that she was also a woman of great stubbornness, and she would occasionally get into fierce arguments with the nuns and her attendants, screaming at them for perceived insults or betrayals. Her anger, which had once been a sign of her passion, was now a sign of her madness. She was a woman who was a prisoner of her own emotions, and she would lash out at anyone who came close to her. Her father, Ferdinand, who ruled as regent in her name, would occasionally visit her. The meetings were cold and tense. He would sit with her, trying to reason with her, trying to get her to a more sane state, but his efforts were in vain. She would often refuse to speak to him, and when she did, her words were laced with a deep-seated mistrust. She knew in her own way that he was responsible for her imprisonment. She was a queen without a kingdom, a daughter without a loving father. Her children, who had been taken from her, grew up to be some of the most powerful people in Europe. Her eldest son, Charles, would become the Holy Roman Emperor, the King of Spain, and the ruler of a vast empire that spanned the globe. Her daughters would marry into the royal houses of Portugal, Denmark, and France. But for Juana, they were a distant memory, a source of both pride and profound sorrow. She was a mother who was not allowed to be a mother, a queen who was not allowed to rule. Historians still argue whether Juana's behaviour was a form of deliberate protest against her imprisonment, or if it was simply a manifestation of her profound mental illness. Was she deliberately refusing to eat or speak as a way of asserting her autonomy in the only way she knew how? Or was she simply a woman who had completely lost her mind and had no control over her actions? It is a question that has no easy answer. There is no doubt that her behaviour was an act of rebellion, but there's also no doubt that she was suffering from a deep and profound mental illness. Her stubbornness was a sign of her will, but her illness was a sign of her broken heart. The years of solitude took a toll on her. She became a figure of pity and dread, a living legend of a tragic queen. The people of Tordesillas would whisper about her, a mad queen who was locked away in a castle, a woman who had lost everything. The stories, while rooted in a tragic reality, were also embellished and exaggerated, and they served to cement her reputation as Juana the Mad. The castle of Tordesillas was not just a prison. It was a living tomb, a final and permanent resting place for a woman who was a queen in name but a prisoner in practice. Her body, once a source of beauty and passion for Philip, was now a vessel of her suffering. Her mind, once so sharp and curious, was now a labyrinth of grief and paranoia. She was a woman who was both here and not here, a queen who was both alive and dead. She was a prisoner of her own heart, a ghost in her own life. The world outside the convent continued to spin. The Castilian nobles, now with Ferdinand as their ruler, were in a state of relative peace. The kingdom, which had been in a state of chaos after Philip's death, was now stable. But the stability came at a price. A queen who was locked away, a woman who was a prisoner of her own family. The stage is now set for a final and surprising act of her life, an act that will remind the world that she was still a queen, even in her cage. The years of solitude and seclusion were not enough to break her spirit. She was a woman who was a prisoner of her own emotions, but she was also a woman of great stubbornness, and her will, even in her madness, would prove to be a powerful and dangerous force. The final act of her life is about to begin, and it will be a reminder to all that even a queen in a cage can still be a queen. You are now in the year 1520, and the quiet, lonely existence of Juana in the convent of Tordesillas is about to be violently interrupted. The kingdom of Castile, which had been under the rule of her father Ferdinand for years, is now in a state of turmoil. Ferdinand had died in 1516, and his grandson, Juana's son, Charles, was now the new king. But Charles, who had been raised in Flanders and spoke little Spanish, was a stranger to the people of Castile. His ascension to the throne was met with a deep-seated mistrust. He was a foreigner, a Habsburg prince who had little regard for Spanish traditions and who was surrounded by Flemish courtiers who were seen as arrogant and greedy. A mainstream historical fact is that this deep mistrust led to a major rebellion, known as the Revolt of the Comuneros. The rebels, a powerful group of Castilian nobles and citizens, were fighting for their rights and their traditions. They were fighting against a foreign king who they believed was a tyrant, and they needed a symbol, a figurehead who could legitimize their rebellion. They turned to the one person who had a more legitimate claim to the throne than Charles, his mother, Juana. You watch as a group of rebels, led by the charismatic leader Juan de Padilla, arrives at the convent of Tordesillas. They do not come as captors, but as liberators. They come to a queen who has been a prisoner in her own home for over a decade. They do not treat her with pity, but with respect. They kneel before her, a forgotten queen who is still, in their eyes, the rightful ruler of Castile. They are not just rebels, they are her subjects, and they are begging for her help. Juana, who has been living in a state of near-constant silence for years, is shocked into a moment of lucidity. This is her chance. This is her moment to be a queen again, to be a person again. She listens to their pleas, her eyes, which had been so hollow, now flicker with a brief, bright spark of hope. She is told of the injustices of her son's reign, of his foreign ways, and of the suffering of her people. She's told that she is their last hope, their only hope. A quirky tidbit about this period is that the rebels, in a desperate attempt to show that Juana was sane, would bring her to the convent chapel, where they would ask her to sign a document that would legitimize their revolt. Juana, who had not signed a document in years, would pick up the quill and sign her name with a firm, clear hand. This was not a sign of madness. It was a sign of a will that had been dormant for too long, now suddenly awakened. For a few brief shining months, Juana is a queen again. She's no longer a prisoner. She's no longer a ghost. She's a figure of power, a symbol of hope. The rebels who have liberated her from her cage treat her with a deep, abiding respect. They listen to her, they serve her, and they wait for her to give them a command. They want her to join them in their revolt, to lead them against her son. But Juana, for all her brief moments of lucidity, is still a woman who is deeply and profoundly ill. She is not a politician. She is not a warrior. She is a woman who has been a prisoner for over a decade, and her mind, while it has had a brief moment of clarity, is still a labyrinth of grief and paranoia. She cannot bring herself to actively betray her son. She is his mother, after all, and even in her madness she still loves him. She's a queen who is caught between two impossible choices: to lead a rebellion against her own son, or to betray the very people who have just given her a taste of freedom. Historians still argue whether Juana's refusal to fully join the rebellion was a political masterstroke or a sign of her complete incapacity to rule. Did she refuse because she knew that her son, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor, would crush the rebellion and that her participation would only lead to a greater loss of life? Or did she refuse because she was simply too ill, too emotionally fragile to make such a momentous decision? The truth, as is often the case, is a combination of both. She was a woman who was a victim of her own illness, but she was also a woman who had a deep-seated maternal love for her son, a love that she could not, and would not, betray. The rebellion, which had started with such hope, is now in a state of chaos. Without a clear leader, without a powerful royal figure to legitimize their cause, the rebels are in disarray. Juana, a queen who had a brief moment of hope, now retreats back into her silent, melancholic state. She's a woman who had a brief glimpse of freedom, but who, in the end, chose the comfort of her cage. The hope that had been so bright for a few months now fades into a distant memory. The rebellion is about to be crushed, and Juana will once again be a prisoner. The stage is now set for the final and most tragic act of her life. The years of solitude and seclusion were not enough to break her spirit, but the brief glimpse of freedom was. She is a queen who had a chance to be a ruler again, and she chose, in the end, to be a prisoner. She is a woman who was both a victim and a queen, a figure of profound sorrow and of great stubbornness. Her life, which was a tragedy from the very beginning, is now nearing its end, and the end for Juana will be a quiet and lonely one. The revolt of the Comuneros, which had offered Juana a brief shining moment of hope, was a flicker that was quickly extinguished. Her son, Emperor Charles V, a man of immense power and political will, had no intention of allowing a rebellion to take hold in his kingdom. He sent his armies to Castile, and the revolt was brutally crushed. The leaders, including Juan de Padilla, were captured and executed, and the dream of a free Castile was shattered. Juana, a queen who had chosen not to take a side in the conflict, was now a prisoner once more, but this time her prison was even more secure. A mainstream historical fact is that her son, Charles V, after crushing the rebellion, ordered that his mother be placed under even stricter guard in the convent of Tordesillas. She was to be isolated from all contact with the outside world, her windows were to be sealed, and all news of her was to be censored. You're now a silent witness to the final and most tragic act of her life. The rebellion had been a brief, bright spark in her long, dark night, but now the darkness has returned, more profound and more permanent than before. Her son, who had once been a source of hope, was now her captor, and he had no intention of allowing her to ever be a threat to his power again. Juana, a queen who had a brief glimpse of freedom, now retreated back into a silent, melancholic state. She was a woman who had been a prisoner for over a decade, and her mind, which had a brief moment of clarity, was now a labyrinth of grief and paranoia. The final years of her life were a testament to her profound sadness and her deep-seated stubbornness. She would spend her days in her room, refusing to eat or speak, a living ghost in a stone cage. Her clothes were still in disarray, her hair unkempt, and her eyes hollow with grief. She was a queen who had lost all interest in the world, a woman who had been stripped of her purpose and her dignity. A quirky tidbit about this period is that she would reportedly sleep in a cold, unheated room, even in the dead of winter, a form of self-punishment that spoke to the depth of her despair. She was a woman who was a prisoner of her own emotions, and her body, once a vessel of her passion, was now a vessel of her suffering. Her son, Charles V, would occasionally send emissaries to her, trying to reason with her, trying to get her to a more sane state. But his efforts were in vain. She would often refuse to speak to them, and when she did, her words were laced with a deep-seated mistrust. She knew, in her own way, that he was responsible for her imprisonment. She was a queen without a kingdom, a daughter without a loving father, and a mother without a loving son. The love that had once brought her so much joy had now become a source of profound suffering. Historians still argue whether Juana's behaviour in her final years was a sign of a complete and total mental breakdown or a form of passive resistance against her son and her captivity. Was she deliberately refusing to speak as a way of asserting her autonomy in the only way she knew how? Or was she simply a woman who had completely lost her mind and had no control over her actions? It is a question that has no easy answer. There is no doubt that her behaviour was an act of rebellion, but there is also no doubt that she was suffering from a deep and profound mental illness. Her stubbornness was a sign of her will, but her illness was a sign of her broken heart. The years passed slowly in the convent. Juana's children grew up and had children of their own. Her son Charles would become the most powerful ruler in Europe, but he was a king who was haunted by the ghost of his mother, a woman who was a constant reminder of his own ambition and his own power. Juana, the rightful Queen of Castile, was a forgotten figure, a tragic figure who was locked away in a small town in Castile. Her death, when it came, was a quiet and lonely one. On April 12th, 1555, after a lifetime of sorrow and solitude, she breathed her last. She was 75 years old, and she'd outlived her husband, her parents, her siblings, and most of her children. Her death was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet end to a quiet life, a final release from a lifetime of suffering. The Mad Queen, the stinkiest queen, the woman with the dead husband, was finally at peace. Her legacy, however, is not a quiet one. The story of Juana the Mad is a cautionary tale, a story of a woman who was a victim of her own passions and her family's political machinations. She was a queen who was both present and absent, a political pawn who had been taken off the board. She was a woman who had lost her voice, and she will now be remembered as a figure of profound sorrow and of great stubbornness. Her life, which was a tragedy from the very beginning, is now at an end. The sun begins to set now, a soft orange glow spilling through the window. The sounds of the day are fading away, and a quiet stillness settles in. The weight of Juana's story, with its grief and its madness, can feel heavy. But remember that her life was also a testament to the power of the human heart, a heart that could love so deeply that it broke, a mind that could endure so much suffering and still, in its own way, fight for its dignity. She was a queen, a wife, a mother, and a woman who was simply too big for the small world she was born into. She was not just Juana the Mad, she was Juana the woman, and her story, in all its tragedy, is a powerful reminder of the cost of love, loss, and power. Now, as the last of the light fades, let the story drift away. Let the images of the dusty roads and the long, slow procession dissolve into the darkness. Let the whispers of a mad queen and the echoes of her sorrow be swallowed by the quiet of the night. Take a deep breath. Let the air fill your lungs and feel the weight of the day lift from your shoulders. The world has been put to sleep, and now it's your turn.